Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for this discussion, which is part of the Publishing as an Artistic Toolbox exhibition, which opened yesterday, and I see some familiar faces, so it's nice that you came again today. And this discussion is actually seen as one of the parts of the whole exhibition project, in which with Luca Lopinto, who curated the show, we thought it would make sense to have a more discursive approach and a kind of a group reflection, inviting a series of people who have been deeply committed to editorial projects in which there's a very strong relation and there's a very strong articulation between the editorial side of a magazine, therefore of a publication that comes out on a periodic manner and somehow establishes a compromise with its readers and of delivering another issue. So there's a promise of returning, no, and of delivering another issue after the first one, and of having a continuation also in terms of an ongoing reflection on some critical issues and that concern cultural production and in particular visual arts, and therefore, as I was saying, inviting individuals who have been engaged in the editorial part of publications that are close to contemporary art and culture and who have a simultaneous, a parallel editorial activity. And having a conversation in which we exactly discuss from the more conceptual and theoretical issues related to the dialogue between magazine publishing and book publishing in the context of the arts, to also more down-to-earth and practical issues related to the motivations, the reasons, the ideas, and also any kind of future outcomes for publishing in the arts, let's say. And the way we're going to be structured is that we're having very brief also because we're very numerous, and so having very brief introductions about each publication and each editorial project, and these introductions will somehow create a common terrain for an open discussion, which hopefully will not only include the participants in this half-moon roundtable, but also those of you who are here, and therefore that there is a form of dialogue and conversation between us. I would already pass the word to Jonas and Cecilia, who will tell us about OEI, about their editorial project, which started in the end of the 90s, right? And afterwards, I would pass the word to Chiara Figone, who has been running from Berlin archive publishing, archive books, but also archive journal, to then to Caroline Woodley, who is coming on behalf of Afterall, who I think is the earliest publications of all, which was started in the second half of the 90s, in 96, by Mark Lewis and Charles Escher, right? Oh, 98. And then having Stefano Cernuschi, who is coming on behalf of Mousse magazine, who today I was doing some research and suddenly I understood it's older than 10 years, which is very surprising. When did it where did this time go? I don't know. And Lorenzo Gigotti, who's coming on behalf of NERO, that started in 2004 and has been going ever since. We're also going to circulate some material. Some of us will be showing some visuals on projected, and we're also having some materials to circulate, so also feel free just spread around the books. So yes.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay, thanks. So OEI magazine started in '99, yes, and OEI editor 2002, which was the year when Cecilia joined the project, and also the year when we published the first book we wrote and photographed together, but with another editor, which was important for us at the time. The magazine was initially a little bit influenced by French and North American magazines like Revue de Littérature Générale, Nyok, Java, and Language. And at the time there was no such thing or magazine in Sweden, so we got quite a lot of attention from the media and also from the poetry and art communities. In publishing quite a substantial number of a text of poetics, also to a certain degree, of course, helped to create. The first books, logically enough, came out of this editorial adventure. I mean, the first books were by poets and artists close to the editorial group, and actually the first one was called Kakbak, the baking of cakes, a conceptual poetry book written in the 80s, but not published at the time because of not finding the right publishing context. And actually that became one of our strands in publishing then, to uncover these kinds of manuscripts from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that didn't at the time find their proper publishing context and edit them for the first time. So during the first years, the magazine was actually much thinner than it is today, when it is regularly 600 pages or more, which we need to have in order to find the possibility to make the montage we want between different types of materials, speeds, and well, registers. So we had a lot of time to publish books, and it seemed quite easy to publish books that were, after all, singular objects and not with this kind of very complex visual verbal montage that we strived to achieve in the magazine. So but already from the beginning we did show every issue as a kind of micro exhibition or a visual display when we released it. Nevertheless, all the books we published were only received in the poetry communities, in the literary context. So it actually took up until 2004, I think, when we worked a lot on, as everyone else at that period, I suppose, on conceptual writing, art writing, etc., to be really a more explicit part of the art world. But the magazine has always been and is still the core of all our activities. As a periodical thing, per definition, of course, the magazine has to be published 2 or 3 at least times a year. But the books and the book series allowed us to try out other ways of serializing publications and in connection to very specific contexts. So, I mean, we brought just a few copies of some early, very small series, like collaboration between the Nordic countries, books that were supposed to be released at the same time in the 3 countries, with all the backsides and etc. about that kind of network situation. Another one, the hyperlocal series, books quite cheap but still nice, I think, that only distributed at the release event, so a little bit like Sartre's bananas, they had to be consumed in a very specific context. An ongoing book series that also came out of the magazine, of course, is this one, We Undersökningar. It's investigations from poets and theoreticians and philosophers like David Antin, Lytle Shaw, Emmanuel Ocar, Rilke Berggren and Roche Didier Berman, etc. And the last series I would like to mention before I let Cecilia talk is actually this one called Oai Books, explicitly pushing the book boundaries, what you can do with a printed book, these kind of black books. But it's up to you to speak about that series. Do you want to circulate? Yeah, please.
So even if Sweden has seen some more experimental publishing initiatives such as Kaleidoskop or Vegpress and Cheese, Bo Cavefors Förlag that were active in the 60s and 70s, or Fireworks editions started in the 80s and still ongoing. When we started publishing books at OEI Editor, we did that because we experienced a lack in the publishing ecology at the time. I will just say some words on some of the first image-based books at OEI, and this was one of the first one by Carl Johan Stigmark. It's called Various Parts Corners World, published in 2007, where Carl Johan departed from Duchamp's concept of the infra-thin to investigate enlarged and recontextualized minimal phenomena of the everyday life. I can also just mention this book by Eva Arnqvist, Grand Tour. It was published in 2014, and it came out of a small space or event space for exhibitions that we initiated in 2012 called OEI Color Projects, that we made different book-related exhibitions for about 3 years, 30 of them, unfolding publications in three-dimensional space, which also included the presence of other publishing activities such as David Jourdan's Westfalia Förlag, for example, in 2014. And those activities also triggered other kind of publishings, such as Manfred Moore's Artificiata 2, for example, that also came out on account of an exhibition. And those that work with the relationship between a spatial three-dimensional spatial structure and publishing also was one of the outcomes of that work was, as Jonas already mentioned, the series OEI Books, where we stress the space of a book as a reading and viewing experience, mostly related also to a spatial experience. And we've been working what we label or called an expanded book or expanded publishing, which also means taking into account questions on distribution, circulation, audiences, reading contexts, that also became a part of the act of publishing in a way. So for us, being a quite specific analog project, the expanded publishing did not really delve into a digital realm, but rather focusing on the larger ecologies of publishing.
So we have should we continue a little bit, because we had another part on the relation between books and magazines, or can we come back to that, or? Yeah, because I mean it's a complicated thing. So the second and the third book we of our own books we did together in 2006 and 2009. They were both 1,000 pages verbal visual montages that we would never have managed to do without working together for a number of years making the magazine. But after that, the balance changed, and the magazine was very much informed by the work we had done with our own books and also books by others, of course. In 2011, we reached some kind of limit. We published an issue of the magazine which was 1,300 pages and 3.9 kilos, and it was a nightmare to distribute. It took us 6 months, so we knew that we would not continue along that line. Just want to say that the work on the magazine is exceedingly time-consuming, and I mean it takes 2 or 3 years for every issue from planning to execution. So publishing books is a way of finding other temporalities and also ways to interact with other systems of reception and distributions, which can be quite a relief, yes. So Oai has never been about self-representation through publishing, but the books we have been making together, often archive and fieldwork based aesthetic research project. They were, as Cecilia mentioned, or I mentioned, published by other editors. The problem was that we were not completely pleased. I mean, we could of course do what we wanted with the book and even supervise the printing, but then again, you could never supervise, you could never have the presentation and the distribution all along. So we just had to give in and take aboard our own projects as editors, which can be also quite difficult. So all in all, I just want to say that it's pretty sure that we have been learning from magazines how to do books in other ways, and learning from books how to do magazines in new ways. So the magazine is extremely labor intensive, but it's a good thing also, of course, to have the opportunity to be in contact with a lot of people you otherwise would never have been able to work with and learn from. So the montage of the magazine, we have needed to expand from the beginnings in poetry and poetics and theory into visual art history, avant-garde history, editorial aesthetics, publishing history, film, geology, archaeology, etc. And I think it has been very, we have been learning a lot from this kind of different disciplines and registers in a very undisciplinized or de-disciplinized way. So yes, you want to add something on that?
No, I'm good.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Is this working? No, maybe there's another one. Oh, now it's working. Now it's working. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for this introduction and for introducing actually one of the issues that I think will be also interesting to open the discussion, which is in fact the relation between the temporalities of magazine and of book publishing, and the temporalities both in terms of something that needs to come out, but also how do they talk and how do they relate to one another. And I believe it makes sense also considering the importance of a publication and of an editorial project as OEI in reflecting on archival procedures and on its relation to documentation, and to really digging and excavating within the less known and maybe even underground histories that have informed so much of our cultural setting and backgrounds. It would be it's interesting to bridge your representation with what Chiara has is bringing here in relation to her activity with Archive Books, which also has a big focus on documentation and on bringing forward materials that previously existing and giving them a new life and a new form. Do you also want me to say this?
Yes, I mean, the newspaper can, there are not so many, but they can also be taken.
So who wants?
So it's quite difficult for me to present archive activities in a short span of time, but I will try to be very short. So I'm saying this because archive is a sort of complex project in the sense that is made of 4 different parts. Is of course first and foremost a publishing house, but the publishing house itself is supported and is fluidly communicating with other parts of the project. One is the journal, which is somehow at the origin of the project, and I will come back to that later. Another part, which is the physical space in Berlin. That is a space focused on publishing that has been also producing in the past 7 years different moments of discussion around our own researches, but also inviting other publishers to use us to discuss their own issues. And a 4th part, which is also quite important because it is important in the way the whole structure works, which is a sort of design department, which is Archive Appendix, and is basically in charge of financing the whole project. So I always like transparency, so I like to talk about how things work also on a more practical level. So in a way, the design office is working on its own project, but also for the publishing house, but is also working for other institutions, and by doing this is actually creating a sustainability for the project, which is by definition a publishing house is not a non-profit activity, but I will say that archive is run as a non-profit activity in the sense that there is like a quite clear flux of what is done with the publishing house is then reinvested in the space, and it's not that I like to speak first about more practical aspects, but somehow it's quite important for me how the practical aspects and the contents are actually moving together. So I will say that I started by mentioning Archive Journal as quite important to Archive's activity, and that's because Archive Journal was the first thing that was done by Archive. So it was in 2018 that I would like to tell you more also about my previous activities in publishing, but again, to keep it short, I'm not going to elaborate that much on that. But I have a background in theater, so I came to publishing from a completely different background, but with a strong attraction towards what happened in many countries, but especially in Italy in the 70s. So the publishing activity was really a laboratory and a creative moment totally intertwined with the political and the social situation. So somehow that was in the back of my mind when I made this switch and I started to work in publishing. I was really trying to see how, making public and sharing and circulating and distributing could actually generate or attempt to generate a community. And maybe now I'm talking about this in a different way in the light of like several years of activity in the publishing world. And I will say that the magazine is somehow a vector, or it could be a vector, or a trigger, an initiator for a small community. So in a way, the editors are calling out for like-minded people or people that are interested in similar subjects, and they want to discuss and use the magazine as a platform to discuss those issues. So somehow, through my previous publishing experience with a magazine called Uovo, and starting a quite specific magazine about curatorial called The Exhibitionist that is now running independently, I sort of formed also my need for a magazine as a tool within the publishing activity of Archive. And I say this because lately we have been focusing more on books. So we publish from anthologies to artist books in a quite large range of publications. But the magazine has something quite specific, and I'm talking to this because I guess it makes sense also, and one of the reasons why we are invited is that going back to this idea of the magazine as a vector and a possible trigger for connecting with people that are interested in similar issues and creating a new space for dialogue in which, of course, the idea of a periodicity and the idea of a coming back with maybe different subjects, but with a similar attitude, because the editorial group behind it is the same, is actually quite beneficial to the rest of our production. So I will say that it's almost, in Archive's case, it was almost inevitable to go from publishing magazines to publishing books, because then we created very solid relationship with artists or curators or critics that wrote on the magazine pages, and then they became friends, they became good alliances. So we decided to maybe moving forward with other projects like readers or anthologies or artist books. And I like to say that we do publish a lot of artist books, and it's funny how, though without really knowing that or doing it knowingly, we ended up working with artists that are mainly working in the position of editor. So they are taking on the responsibility of the editor. So it's, I will say that is maybe an approach that refers less to the history of artist book related to what has been done, for example, in the 60s or 70s. I think it's a quite common practice, though, in the past 10 years, developed quite a lot. And it's, of course, more common with artists that have a research-based practice, I will say, and most of the time the final work doesn't contain, cannot contain the full picture. Again, most of the elements that are very relevant during the research are not making it to the final work. So the book becomes actually the perfect home for all this material that has been collected, organized, reconnected also at the same time, because maybe it was taken from an archive and it was placed in circulation again. It was rediscussed with a series of people involved in a publication, and so then the publication becomes a perfect home for this material. And that's how we sort of created this link from the publishing from the publishing of the magazine and the publishing of different books. And some of the editor of the magazine are actually artists that we have been working with. So I mean, I'm going back to this idea of basically creating a small community of like-minded people. That doesn't mean that there are no misunderstanding or difference of opinion, but it means that there is a quite safe space to be very clear about the priority and the subjects that we are interested in, we as part of a group. So I have two publications. Republication is one special issue of Archive Journal. So Archive Journal comes more in a sort of ephemeral form. And I will add that most recently we restarted with this project, and this is actually the first issue in this form, and is also quite connected with the space. I'm not going to elaborate that much about the space in Berlin, but again, the artists and the writers and the authors we have been working with for the publishing house and the journal then somehow end up using our space, maybe to organize programs themselves or for an exhibition. So that's why I always speak about Archive as an organization that is focused on publishing, but is also, I mean, taking different forms, and it allows people that are interested in working in the form of a book, using the book as the space of a book, but also a three-dimensional space, and then see how contents can be organized and presented in different forms. So this specific journal that some of you, I mean, that I brought today, came out in relation to a program in the space that took place in August, September, around a Mauritanian film director, Medondo. It's a long story, so I'm not gonna tell you much more, and you find some in this specific issue, but I'm mentioning this because we, while developing our publishing activity, we also more and more started to work with filmmaker and artists using the moving image in their practice. So it became even more important for us to create new form of publications to actually contain the material that most of the time is there during the production of a film, and also think about how to translate something that is meant for moving images into a publication. And this specific project with around the films of Medondo also brings in another element, which is the idea of always working on two different registers of materials. So trying to look at what has been already produced in of course using archives, and we have been collaborating with many artists that are using archives in their own practice. So finding material that is already out there and maybe can be reconnected with other aspects by being recirculated. And that's what, for example, in this issue we did with the two texts that Medondo wrote in the 70s about African cinema. But then putting this in context and creating new contents around it to create the possibility to of course, always look into the origin of the document, and so when it was produced, why it was produced, who published it first, but also how this document can be still relevant, how can a content that is already there can be recirculated and generate a new discussion and open up new spaces for discussion. So in a way, this specific issue is quite important because it puts together the activity in the space that were made of a program of screening and a few workshops, the reprint of material from the author, and so the making of the journal, and now we are working on a publication that will come out in a year. So it's like a very fluid way of working with authors. That's why I kind of like to go to the point where most of the authors we work with becomes they sort of alliances, in the sense that they are then taking over new projects involving us. So it's quite nice how this idea of bringing together a certain group is growing quite organically. And just to close, I would say that it's been quite important, I guess, for Archive to be in Berlin, because I feel like a lot of the contents that have come out in the past years were actually developed in a city that has a quite specific context. You know, there are other cities where it's quite difficult to operate outside the market, or to kind of work on projects that are really not, you know, so connected to the financial structure of the art world. But Berlin is still one of those places where you can find a lot of support, public support, I guess, but also more communitarian support within, you know, in collaboration between writers, curators, artists. There is quite a lot of support that makes this type of fluidity possible.
Thank you very much, Chiara. And moving from Berlin to a very different context from that of London, and thinking about an editorial project, which actually, interestingly, also defines itself as a research center. Right? Its inception defined itself as a research center, as that of Afterall, which has also a very privileged mode of existence, because it's far from being the classical university press, but nonetheless operates and exists from within a very specific academic context, as that of an art school. And also still bridging with what Chiara was mentioning about archive, also has an ongoing activity whose dialogue between past and present and past and future is very visible, because on the one hand, the editorial side of Afterall Books and its different series often focus on on the history of exhibitions, on specific projects that artists did, and that became almost canonical gestures within our artistic practices, while the magazine, and I was going through my own collection of Afteralls, and it's impressive to see that many of the artists, because Afterall gives huge focus to individual artists, and how many of the artists that have been have had a focus on Afterall became fundamental figures for the present time. So it's having this ongoing discussion between the histories of art and the histories of culture, and what is presently being done. So I'll pass the word to Caroline.
Thank you. It's really good to be here in the context of this exhibition, actually, as I personally started out doing independent publishing, artist-run publications, and saw the publication as an opportunity to travel in a way that exhibitions didn't, and saw them as quite democratic objects. I mean, obviously you can have unique and highly priced and valuable objects, but you can also mass produce and circulate and disseminate, and that's always been very interesting for me. So Afterall Journal was founded in '98, and so next year will be our 20th anniversary, and I think this is the first of probably many discussions we'll have looking back and thinking about what we've achieved and what we have still to do. This pilot issue, as you say, it includes Jeremy Daller, Superflex, Pavel Buchler, Fiona Banner. I mean, Jeremy Daller, obviously Turner Prize winner, but perhaps more importantly to my context in England, if any of you are following the kind of political movements, he did this wonderful poster project in response to the Conservative Party's slogan, Strong and Stable, which was this huge poster called Strong and Stable My Arse, which was pasted up around London and appeared in social media. And yeah, so I'm now a fangirl for Jeremy Daller. So the journal was founded, as Filipa says, in the context of research culture coming to universities. And this is a very particular culture, problematic culture, often a culture that props itself up. Many journals that came out of that culture are peer review. Authors are often unpaid, but they produce outputs, their articles, and later publications are submitted to a research excellence framework. And this is a kind of structure that we both benefit from and speak to, but always critically, and we have always sort of been sort of in between the approved structures, which I have to say has caused me many nightmares over the years, but I think it's always an interesting place to be, somehow at the edges of a quite heavy-handed structure. So we are not a peer-reviewed journal, we are a curated publication, I suppose. We haven't changed that much in structure over almost 20 years. This first issue, it's 5 artists with 2 essays on each artist, and then usually 2 essays which look at the broader context, political, social, philosophical, within which those artists work. We often invite artists to write, as well as art historians, literary writers, critical thinkers, theorists, and we ask them to think about this broader context, and it was interesting actually just reading the forward to this pilot issue, issue 0, that Mark Lewis and Charles Escher was sort of trying to pitch that the artist was a critical intellectual, and that there was an important discussion to be had about where the artists position themselves critically. So I joined Afterall 2003, so next year will be my 15th year, so that's a big chunk of my life. And I brought in this sort of impetus, I guess, to stretch out into books. So, yeah, sure. One of the frustrations with the journal was that you might be very excited about an artist because they'd made a particular work that you wanted to look at in more depth, but perhaps you didn't want to discuss them over 2 essays in a tightly curated project. Another frustration was that you might have a contextual essay which just felt so of the moment and so important and was 3,000 words and just did not do it justice. So what we did was we invested in, I guess, depth and breadth. So in terms of depth, we started this series called the One Work series, where we commission authors to write between 16 and 20,000 words, sometimes 25,000, on a single work of art. This seemed to be an amazing sort of opportunity for a writer to really know and understand an artwork and to provide an artist with an alternative look at their practice from the traditional monograph. Often the most successful books are kind of monographs. This is our most recent one, which I'm hugely proud of. This is David Hammond's Blizzard Ball Sale by the amazing Elena Filipovic, who has done years of research for this. It's really oral histories of artists, practitioners, photographers, people, friends around David Hammond's. I think the first book we did was Bassionada's In Search of the Miraculous, which again is like a very poetic work, which is like a gateway into that artist's practice. Other books have been voices for artists. I'm thinking of Greg Bordowitz's book on General Ideas Image Virus, where Greg positioned himself initially reluctantly and quite bravely, I think, as someone who is HIV positive, who'd been engaged in cultural activism, who had actually been very critical of General Ideas Image Virus when he first encountered that work, and over the course of the book becomes more and more appreciative of it, and it's very engaging reading for, you know, this host of reasons. It's a marvellous voice. This is a series I edit, so it's the one I can speak to most. At the same time, we did these broader projects. So this is the breadth rather than depth. So the texts, I guess, are often quite short. There's maybe manifestos. There's posters, got wonderful sort of Walter Crane, Stop the War posters. Quirky projects. There's an artist called Bonnie Shirk in the States who made these sort of gardens, community gardens under motorway bridges. There's, you know, your William Morris. There's Black Panther. It's a chronicle of art and social change, and our guest editor, Will Bradley, said that it should really be artists and the desire for social change, because art and social change are not always in that effective, but it was a wonderful thing to do. But we've only done sort of 2 or 3 of these readers. They're a beast to produce. We're all part-time, as most of us are either artists, writers. I've got engaged in politics for some crazy reason. So we're all doing other things. So we kind of have to keep things practical and functional and modest. I don't think we print anything more than sort of 3,000. Distribution we do in partnership. So the One Work series we distribute with the MIT Press. We modelled it on the work they do with semiotext, who I'm very admiring of. Chris Kraus I've heard speak about semiotext a few times, and her series within that, and one of the claims she's made for it is always keeping her books in print, which I have to say is not something we have easily managed to do. It's expensive to print books. What we do is create ebooks, just to kind of keep the content in circulation, but it's not quite the same thing. So a few years later, I don't know how much you want to get into the dysfunctional family of Afterall, but the founders are still together, and I'm sort of like the broken child in the relationship. But one of the interesting tensions, I guess, is that between the two founding editors, Mark Lewis, who's an artist, and Charles Escher, who's a curator, director of the Van Abbe Museum, runs biennials, is this idea, I guess, from Mark sometimes, is that the pure object, the art object, the modern object, he still kind of has this flag, I guess, for modernism somehow. And Charles is about the questioning, the breaking down of that, the demodernizing, the decolonializing, the looking outside of the sort of the canon, I guess, as it stands. And it's a friction to be amongst. And one sort of thing that we kind of hadn't tackled, I guess, was this moment of display and what happens outside of what the artist intended or what the curator intended, but this moment of exhibition when artists come together and other things happen, perhaps. And we have this sort of amazing series which coincides with the teaching that we do at the art school, that we have a sort of a pathway that we run within the MRes art program called Exhibition Studies. And we started to realize that there actually weren't that many books on exhibitions, or kind of gathered, collated exhibition histories. So we decided that we would do them. And Lucy Steeds is the editor. I think Pablo Lafuente was initially working on this with her. And she's amazing, and she writes on exhibitions as well. I think she's done one of the Whitechapel document series on the exhibition. And these are more slow-burning publications, probably about, if we're lucky, 18 months to produce. They're not as much of a nightmare as these 500-page anthologies, but they're serious projects, research projects for us, as well as for the people that we invite to contribute. And we look at these exhibitions through archival documentation, through the curator's original letters, correspondence, press release, how the critics responded at the time, how the artists felt about it at the time in whatever documentation we can find, but also how they feel about it now, looking back. And the only other series I'm going to talk about is not really a series yet, it's a one-off. Every now and then I get frustrated that I don't really work with artists that much. Only occasionally will they write long text for the One Work series. And we had this sort of celebratory publication to coincide with a fundraiser that we were doing, and I think 40 years of visual pleasure and narrative cinema, a sort of key feminist text by Laura Mulvey, and we decided to produce this as a 2 works. Instead of the 1 work, it's 2 works. And we asked an artist to respond. So Rachel Rose looked at this essay afresh and made a visual response in publication form. And that's that.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Do you also want to just circulate this book? So, okay. And we're now moving towards, since I was talking about geographies, from Berlin to London, and we're moving towards our last two participants, and both of them come from a very unique context that emerged in Italy in the early 2000s. Early mid-2000s, and which created a very specific context for arts publications and specifically related to Arts Magazine. And it's the fact that this has been discussed and studied and analyzed, but it's still remarkable to observe how in a country, and Wovo was also part of this, or it was almost a grandmother of of these projects, and how in a specific moment in a specific country, there we observed the emergence of very unique editorial projects, most of them magazines, most of them that initiate as a free press, and then they gain a different life, and they grow, and they mature, and they start also, continuing with the family metaphor, to have their own offspring, being their editorial projects, and also multiplying their activities as offering also design agencies, and one of these initiatives is exactly Mousse, which is an editorial project that started in Milan in 2006, and of which, curiously, by coincidence, the team of designers who has been working with Mousse is also responsible for the display of this exhibition, or for this roof-like installation in which these publications and journals and magazines are almost like cats perched on the different parts of the roof. And with this, I'm going to pass the word to Stefano Cernuschi, who is telling us about Mousse.
Yeah, I just want to credit. Can you hear me? Yeah. I want to credit the designers for this, but that's like an entirely side private project that, you know, we all sort of involved in many different more or less secretive hobbies. Yeah, I don't really know if it's been studied. It's certainly been discussed, but like how that happened, that like in Italy we all started publishing like crazy. Yeah, no, but that was like the point that I was trying to, you know, maybe raise. Well, not make, but raise. Maybe we've been like publishing so much because we've been talking and arguing and discussing and speculating so much, because we didn't do really, in actuality, we didn't really accomplish a lot. Like, so not much was happening in Italy, like in terms of like contemporary practices. So we all had to look out, and many of us had to move out. But that's a condition that is really important, I think, when you think as an editor, because like you sort of like look at things on a playing field and you're not in the middle of things. Like it's really impossible to think of Freeze as a magazine that is not thought originally in London and like that didn't respond to that like specific circumstances. The same as the Art Forum. We, on the other hand, we couldn't count on like Milan to fill our content, so we had always to look out. Thankfully, that coincided to the advent of low-cost flying, so like it was. Well, it worked out. Also, like there is this peculiar and complete lack of any sort of even conceivable quest for public funding. So that I think informed very much how we structure like our both the magazine and the publishing, and also like our internal structure of like way of working and how each and everyone in the office, we're now numbering 20 people, do things. And what kind of projects to prioritize, what kind of project to seek funding for, what kind of project to produce ourselves. Like the balance is always sort of complicated. But the first book that we did 2 years after the first issue, or maybe 1.5 years after the first issue, and it was a 16 pages hand-stapled fanzine with no text, black and white, on an artist that we didn't really know about, with a notable caveat that we had just featured her in the magazine, and her name is Ida Ekblad, and she had a show in a gallery that is long closed in Milan, and we printed 250 copies and hand-stapled them, and we had this remarkable budget of 600 euros to do that, and that was our first book. We have now reached 400 titles. Most of them are small to medium-sized artist monographs and exhibition catalogs. That is, like, I think, that really attests to the fact that now art publishing is mostly like, well, I wouldn't know if mostly, but like it's substantially like an institutional prerogative. So, like the way art institutions now think is that if you make an exhibition of an artist, then you also have to give the artist a way of publishing a book, and we sort of intercepted this way of making, like this condition of publishing, and we've done quite well with that. But I just wanted to talk specifically about 2 projects that we published, because those are projects that wouldn't have existed if not if we didn't have a magazine and if we didn't publish a magazine. And the first one that I didn't bring with me because it's out of print, it's called 10 Fundamental Questions of Curating, and it's a it now exists only as a book, but it was a series of inserts in the magazine. It's an idea of what is now our editor-at-large, Jens Hoffman, in New York, and he invited 10 writers and critics to respond to 10 questions that sort of underpin curatorial concerns and practices. And they were sort of basic, like, or let's say open question, what is an exhibition, or like, what's the role of the artist? We published this thing in chapters in the magazine over 2 years, but the idea was, like, from the get-go that this would have been a book. And I think in the grand tradition of, like, books that debut on magazines and journals, like also some of the best novels, we sort of like did that. We had a private backing for this whole project, so like a private foundation fell in love with the idea and paid that. But it was like an exercise for us in perseverance and also thinking long term, because like the magazine is not only temporal, but like it forces you to sort of move on instantly to the next issue and like to think in terms of like what you publish, if it's relevant in that, like, or at least for us, like I feel this very acutely. It's also like, I think the secret of why the magazine has been so well read, it's because people think it's meaningful in that specific time. After a year of from publication of this book, that is so far our bestseller book, we reprinted 2 times, we embarked in a new, crazy, 2 years long enterprise, I would say. And again, the partner in crime was also, in our case, Elena Filipovic. She came to us saying, I want to do this book called The Artist as Curator, and I have no idea how else to do it, if not like in a magazine. Of course, we had the precedents of like these 10 fundamental questions, but not even like the full editorial plan for the series was there by the time we started it. But we said like we have to start it, like we cannot like really wait for everything to fall into place. We felt it was urgent to begin, and it eventually culminated in this book that is, unlike the first book I was talking about, unlike the 10 fundamental questions, this is actually the exact replica of what was published in the magazine. There were again 10 inserts with 2 essays each, and the layout and the paper and everything has been kept. So this is sort of like a copy center exercise, or I wish it looks like that. It's not. But this, on the other hand, this project like really required unprecedented efforts in fundraising, and it was a project we approached, for which we approached institutions. Like, with the idea was like this had to be, or had to come across as like scholarly and had to feel right, and so it couldn't be dependent on some sort of private backing. We do have private individuals that like also help the institutions supporting us, but this was eventually, this was done in 3 years in the end. And so if I have to think of like the craziest book that we've been working on, some of them like took over a year, but that's entirely like out of, you know, let's say, I don't know the euphemism. Well, you know, artists. In this case, it was really like it took years to, you know, put together this and commission this kind of content, and it's something that we could have not have done if it wasn't for the magazine, and if it wasn't like to have a, you know, like a box in which to place it and package it.
Thank you, Stefano. And moving to our final presentation before we open for a dialogue, moving from Milan to Rome to Nero, and somehow my first impression when I first came across Nero was that this was a group of extremely bright, extremely active and energetic people. Not to say that they're not anymore, but who had this conviction in what they believed, in what they knew, in what they were discovering, and wanted to share and publish their thoughts. And needed to find the right place and didn't find the right place to do it, and needed to find the right place to do it, and in searching, not finding, created a publication, NERO, who exactly allowed for a whole generation of people to come together, creating a sort of a community, an extended community of individuals that found each other and finally found a place where they could experiment with writing, where they could experiment for their passion that was transdisciplinary, went from cinema to music to interest in underground and avant-garde architectonic projects to touching a whole range of different possibilities. And exactly, NERO grew up, matured, and came into the current existence by this exact desire of let's come together, and since we don't find a place to where to publish our writing and where to do our things, we'll do it ourselves. And here we are, like so many years
Thank
after.
you for amazing presentation. Yeah, I think, I mean, I make shorter as possible to open up the discussion. So what I can say is probably our, history, let's say, could be a sort of trajectory that a lot of publishers have in common. And so I would like just to show you a little bit our, background. So NERO started in 2004, and at the time, there was this common economical system of publishing called free press. It still exists, and it was kind of new at the time, and there wasn't so many magazines, and especially focus on art. So we start to adopt this system to finance the project, and it was basically on 48 pages, very like rough, maybe coming more from a sort of underground background than proper educated or cultivated project in the art world. So it was about music, art, visual art, of course, design, and a lot of music, honestly. And little by little, we move from, you see, this kind of self-thought publishing to something more articulated and closer to the art world. Also because at that time, there was a sort of uprising network of gallery in Rome, Milan, and Turin that support us a lot. So there was the reason why beyond our interest, of course, we move a little bit closer to the art world and engaging more like the contents of the art instead of music and random stuff from that represent more our interest and desire. So we move to this, something more, you see, articulated, like embracing the language and the codex, let's say, of the art world, starting to deal with institutions, galleries, artists, of course, but the idea was still, involving in a very direct way artists and author in producing contents and considering the magazine as a space of experimentations and sharing knowledge, creating, trying to find a way to create a community that didn't exist at the time in Italy. There was a huge lack of, institutional spaces and support for this kind of project. So what I can say is basically we start to really conceive the magazine as a space to work together with the artists and the author that they were directly involved in the production of the contents, as you say before. And so instead of commenting art, we thought it could be more interesting to developing contents related to art and other disciplines or realm of contemporary culture through the help of the artists and the authors or curators and so on. Little by little, this project became quite radical. And so at the end, the magazine was conceived as you see here in this picture, this is a sort of index. it was conceived as a compendium of autonomous sections. There were like imagine like rooms where authors and artists should respond to our proposal and activating a new process of interpretation of contents, rethinking modalities of presentation and fruition of the contents. And it was exactly like that. And yeah, after maybe 4 years, we start to publish books, also according and relating to our magazine productions. And so what I can say is basically we adopt the same methods that we use in the magazine, developing this project with the artists and using art more as an attitude or yeah, a method to produce knowledge. And so we were like focused on artist books, let's say, so like specific publications that more or less broke this kind of periodical production of content that it was very, I mean, complicated to support, I mean, to finance actually, and create also kind of bad flux of coincidences and so on. So books represent something more independent and autonomous than a periodical production of issues of a magazines. And now, yes, we basically move from quite larger range of publication, from anthology to monography, artist books, and also like catalogs for exhibition that of course are the most common production in publishing since institution. I agree with Stefano. I used to produce for every event or exhibition a publication on using like printed matter as a form of legitimation and also as a form of yeah, like I guess like also a way of occupy the public space behind like the white cube or the institutions. And so right now, yeah, I mean, this is more or less the trajectory, and what I can say that now we're moving in this kind of yeah, articulation of departments in NERO, from studio design studio to publishing house to magazines online, and we open also a new website recently. I didn't say that we moved from Italian language to a bilingual and then finally like just English, that it was a kind of a big issue for Italian culture, of course, because we were forced somehow to adapt English to communicate to a larger audience and to basically to the art audience, let's say. But it was a big how do you say, like it was, yeah, I mean, we at a certain point realized that we lost something like a direct relationship with an audience, also with the local audience. So recently, after 14 years of production and maybe 10 years of production, mostly in English, we decided to move a little bit back, and we decided to open a new website using a digital form for providing contents that of course are less expensive. And so right now we are trying to also like articulate more the complexity of our project and try to address our contents to different audience, from the artwork, from a sort of global art audience to a local one.
Okay. Thank you, Lorenzo. What I think is clearly emerging from these individual introductions to these all very unique editorial projects, I think, is that a series, not a one roundtable discussion, but a series of roundtable discussions would be necessary to analyze in depth the specificities of art and cultural publishing, no? Because here together we have so many different approaches to art publishing that go from the publication of monographic researches that in themselves stand in a very uncertain balance between the magazine and the book, which is the case of OEI, in which each issue that comes out is in itself such an outstanding exhaustive research that is closer, even in its physicality, to a book than that of a periodic magazine, to other publications which put an emphasis on different forms of criticism and of giving space for art criticism to continue to exist. And this would open yet another door, which is that of reflecting on the current role and the current function and the current health of art criticism in the present days, in which everyone is entitled to an opinion and finds their own space to express that opinion, to other kinds of publications which have a very close dialogue, as Chiara and Lorenzo were mentioning, of just diluting the professional figures, and in which curators and artists become editors now, and in which the space of the magazine and the space of the book are in constant dialogue by focusing on similar professional figures and on similar actors, giving them, of course, a different time, which is the time of the magazine and the time of the book, and therefore, in the impossibility of having all these different roundtable discussions, I think an issue, and I will leave an open question for those who want to answer, but an issue that I think concerns us all, and is an issue that is unresolvable, I think. So it's impossible to find a final answer to this question. But it's a question in the moments in which of my lower editorial life, in which I'm on my own for 4 days in front of the computer, talking to people, to editors, to writers, working on texts, I very often find myself asking or feeling that I'm like an outcast in an island, and who is throwing messages in a bottle, and I don't know if they're ever going to be read by anyone. So why are we editing these texts and spending 5 hours in discussing a comma and looking at the fact check of something? Who will read this text, and thinking about readership. And I remember when I moved house recently, I found myself, and I'm talking about myself also with being involved in editorial aspects, but I found myself with a pile of books that I thought would benefit from to circulate instead of being in my house. And I went to this charity shop, and I went with all the books, really well-intentioned, and the woman looked at me and said, I never saw anything like this. Art publishing, they publish so many books and then no one buys them. And I found myself very sad, still with the books, giving them to the public library of where I live. And still thinking about this, I remember in an editorial of Afterall, one of its editors, Anders Kruger, wrote this incredible article which was entitled "How to Read an Art Magazine." And I remember the first time I read it, I thought he was asking himself, who reads an art magazine? And so my question is a little bit distorting. This question is thinking about readership. Is this something that you think about? Who is reading us? How are these magazines being read? Is this something that affects conditions your editorial agenda, both in terms of the different journals and different publications, but also in terms of books? I mean, we're in a very privileged context. We're not editors who need to change the content of their authors because they're going to sell more if they have the word New York or if they have this other word in the title. But we still, readership, does it still matter? Does it matters? Anyone has anything to say about this?
No, it's a really very, very, very tricky question because it entails a lot of discussion around the publishing world. But I feel like maybe there are a few points that could be addressed. You know, the fact that art books are not sold, that's not fully true. Is that most of the time, and especially in what Stefano and Lorenzo were describing, when books are financed, fully financed, they are a request of an institution. They are not the will of an editorial group. Then they can exist regardless of the audience that they will find, because they are financed by an institution or by a group that already needs this to happen. So this is why you will find a lot of interesting books that have been paid for, produced, distributed for free to a certain amount of people that are interested in the specific subject of an exhibition or the production of an artist. So there is no responsibility into even finding a readership, because it's not necessary somehow, you know. It's like the book comes fully financed, and it doesn't matter what happened after. And even if it matters, what happened after is very complex, because the distribution network is not functioning very well. I mean, what Afterall does is great, because it manages, I mean, I think Afterall created a bridge between the classical academic production and the most like open and distributed journal, and it really did it in terms of space, in terms of distribution, type of contents. But besides certain channel of distribution is a big issue. And so when you manage to have a very beautifully produced book about an artist or an exhibition, but you cannot have, you cannot access as efficient distribution network, then all the efforts are also falling apart. So I'm just going to very specific cases, but I guess that, I mean, the main difference between publishing in other fields and the art publishing is that most of what is produced in the art world is actually produced because there is already a commission, there is already the need for a certain publication to be out there. It serves other purposes. Even when it's not a catalog, it is a catalog, you know, most of the time, even if it's a different format, is disguised, but is in the end is the interest in producing a certain publication is already there. And instead, in other fields, the publisher is actually suggesting, okay, we should publish this and that, you know, starting from different, maybe from different manuscripts that are received to the publisher, but then deciding what needs to be circulated, what needs to be heard today, why, and etc., and looking for the famous audience and readership. And again, I think that in a way, how Afterall came into doing books, it's a little bit that. It's like expanding of a solid readership that was established through the magazine, and then and a great community of writers and researchers and theorists. I'm speaking to Afterall more because I know I'm a reader, and so it works in talking about this in a way, you know. So not only you kind of created slowly the audience and the potential readers and a relationship with them, but also at the same time developed a group of writers and authors able to follow a certain type of quality in terms of text, in terms of, you know, style and etc. So, but this is also because what was mentioned by Filipa, there is this very interesting structure behind how Afterall came into being, because it's not an academic press, but it still is. So it's a very interesting liminal space that you manage to create. And I think this is, I mean, for me, this is militant publishing. It's like really creating space where it's not there, finding the possibility to connect with an audience and pull out contents that are actually important to be discussed. But unfortunately, in most of the other cases, publishers are working sometimes more as and I mean, I'm talking about archive included, as a receptor of what could be published. So we receive commissions, and then we we know somehow that certain publication might not have a long life. No, they are publication that sometimes you ask yourself as a publisher if you want to circulate these contents or not. Sometimes you don't, in terms of different editorial lines. There are editorial lines more open and more closed. But even when you ask yourself if that's something that needs to be read or not, there is still the need for, there is still someone that wants a publication out. So that's why the discussion around readership is not so easy, because it's the same discussion in the art world about audiences. It's actually pretty much the same. And this idea that art books are not really sold, or it's somehow it's kind of lies in this fact that the book is already served the purpose when it's printed, and it's almost like there is no need to further work on the life cycle of the book after that. So, and I'm saying this as a condition of our production. It's not really an escapable one. In case, and I will close here, in case for the Italian faction on this side, we all started to work in a very similar way, really out of necessity. The magazine is not enough, not self-sufficient, but it attracts certain people that could become potential partner for other publications. That other publications are helping the editorial group to actually work more constantly with similar authors, and then maybe use them also for the magazine. And so somehow we kind of ended up following the same model, which is actually content-wise is very beneficial, because then again you work with authors that you can trust, and you kind of establish a really nice network of people around you. But on the other hand, is not really functioning somehow. It functions only when you buy into the producing what comes to you. No questions asked.
Yeah. Someone wants to add something, or
what I can say, and totally agree with you. Just to say that most of the time we consider like art at the center of the world, but actually, art publishing is a super small niche, and we should also say that for all the publishers at the moment, it's quite problematic, the situation. Like maybe 50% of Europeans read one book per year. This is just statistic data. And what I can say, if you think about art publishing, I would say that probably is the most amazing moment ever, even if it's still very, very problematic.
I see Luca and Hector looking at the clocks, look at the watches with a worried face. I think this was a little bit optimistic in terms of time, since it's already 8:30. So maybe I'll do a question, open the question, and then open up also to some audience's questions. And I have a question that I would like to start with Cecilia and Jonas, and then open up for those who want to also follow up. And it concerns not so much readership, but also a relation between national or local and international audiences, and continuing this idea, who do we publish for, and the fact that Lorenzo and also Stefano were magazines that started in the language of the country where they were, and then the language, they felt the need to just widen, to open the publication also to an international audience, having to negotiate with their local audience, who are still feeling very much that it's their magazine, because it's produced, it's made by a body of people who works in a specific city. It's not like eFlux that we're everywhere. There's a base, and it's a very important thing that these, as you were saying, archive exists, has its identity because it's grounded in Berlin, so on and so forth. So I wonder, given the fact that OEI is so specific, it has distribution, it's not an easy, especially the magazine, an easy magazine to distribute, to circulate, also given its considerable weight. How do you reflect, and how do you consider the relation that you have between the local and the international context?
Start. I mean, many of the things we do just don't travel. They can't travel. So, and one of the reasons why we had to expand the montage of the magazine is that there were so many histories that weren't written in Sweden. I mean, art historical ones or literary ones. So we had to do that in the magazine. The history of conceptual art in Sweden, the history of land art in Sweden, the history of mail art in Sweden, and so on. And of course, that's bricolage of very, very specific local archives that just don't travel. I mean, that doesn't exclude that we do English issues. We do that. I mean, but we can't do every issue in English. It's just not viable. And I don't think it would be interesting for us. I mean, just specific things need specific contexts and light and impact, etc. And everything doesn't need to travel in the same way, of course. But the readership that question is really important in terms of also that kind of local historiography, because we feel it. I mean, it's a constant, of course, struggle as with all of you. We can't take readers for granted at all today. It's so atomized. I mean, when we started, we as we said, we were part of building up, creating specific communities and readerships, but even those are falling apart. I mean, it's very tricky, and that's why we talk about this expanded publishing, this kind of general publishing ecology. So the next issue we are doing, it's not a printed issue. It's an exhibition at Moderna Museet in Stockholm, really. But it's a publishing event. It's a 2-month publication, yes, and that's one of the ways to attract also international and of course local potential readers. So yeah.
Yeah. I have one. Yeah. No, but I think that's also one of the reasons that we have worked so much on the notion of a more expanded publishing in a way and organized. I think it's more than 300 different events during the last 10 years or so. So it's also been constant work of kind of creating audiences and thinking of publishing not as something that is finished when the publication is printed, but it's continuing into different various registers. But I mean, OEI as a magazine, it has an ISSN number and an ISBN number, and it's a subscriber-based magazine, which means that it follows some different structures or logics that are related to other commitments by libraries or individual subscribers. At the same time as it circulates as ordinary printed publication within the book distribution format. I think that's also this way of trying to a little bit counter the exceeding atomization of individual books that we publish is also a way that we, for the last 2 years, try to publish 6 or 7 books at the same time. So they also kind of more, in a more manifest way, will address the publishing ecology that they are a part of. So I think that's the way of thinking of editing books that are coming from the practice of doing a magazine. But yeah.
Why did we stop publishing in Italian? Because nobody else could read it. And it's really difficult to ask for an artist, like to ask an artist for images, because hey, we're doing a piece about you, but you won't be able to read it, or to ask a museum for like again installation views, because we're organizing an interview with an artist that is in that featured exhibition. Like we always, I guess, not always, but like very, very soon we came to realize that we had to speak, like we had to at least hope to be speaking to everybody, or like to the wider audience possible. But that's also how our magazine wants to, function and coming across. We are just like a contemporary art magazine. It's like very, very simple and straightforward, and cultural production is overwhelmingly, like also scholarly production, like books are only published in English. Like we nowadays, like I think in across all disciplines, but more like especially contemporary art, it's difficult to find a website of a gallery that's like in any other language. Even if the gallery is in Berlin, I don't think there is any gallery in Berlin that has a German website. They do?
Bilingual.
Which ones? Oh, less and less. Less and less.
Hopefully that's not the trend.
No, well,
Forgetting
no.
about every other language and just use English.
Well, no, it's a language to be speaking about, like certain kind of information, press releases and stuff. So that's why. I just wanted to say something about like readership versus circulation, then readership and consumption, because who buys the books anyway? Like, people buy the books, but then who are they? Do they read them? At least in our case, like this is a really pressing concern. Like I don't even know if we should be concerned with that, but like, they're mostly graphic designers, and like it's difficult to understand. No, text like are need to be laid out, but and that's a part. And like for the magazine again, like of course, no, we do care about circulation. It's essential to us because like we, that's part of our content. Like we are putting that figure for sale together with our content. Like we say, we want to do this because we want this to reach like the most, like a targeted audience, but it has to be as big as possible in order for us to make economies that, allow us to produce that sort of content, or to pay for that sort of content in the first place. So, yeah.
That are not read by anyone. Yeah.
Well, no, I don't believe that, but like, yeah.
Shall we, among many of us art book readers, questions? Someone wants to ask something?
I have a question that maybe joins the question about readership, about consumption, because it's art publishing in general. I think it's not something where you can get a lot of money from. So what I'm interested in, how do you finance the project? I mean, I've worked in an art publishing house in Morocco, of course. Morocco is a very precarious situation for such an industry, but still, I mean, there's not a lack of ideas. There's not a lack of content, but I definitely saw that there is a lack of financing these projects.
Well, it's. I was quite envious when you talked about sitting in front of a screen for 4 days editing and wondering where it goes, because I would say that 90% of my time is focused on the financing, funding, relationship building, relationship maintaining. Actually, I would say maintenance is a key word to our whole organisation. We want to be a caring, nurturing organisation focused on maintenance not only of the project itself, but taking care of our staff, taking care of our authors. We pay everybody. We will not pay ourselves and not pay others. We don't want to ride on the research culture, as I described earlier, where people might do it for outputs. We'll pay everybody so that we can step outside of that. And that's a lot of money, and print is expensive. And it's, so the way we do it is we spread costs thinly across other, many sources. We have some support from the university, so the professors that founded this are on salary. The rest of us, we raise money for. We have support from Arts Council England, so this whole question of readership is interesting to me because they're very big on audiences, art for everyone. You have to reach out and find your communities, identify them, nurture them, make sure you're speaking to them. That's a big thing. Endless applications for small amounts of money for interesting projects. Partnership. So one of the models that's made the journal so core to what we do, and the books kind of speak back to it, is this partnership model where we team up with other organisations that also want to partake in specific research, particularly like this idea at the moment of the demodernising or the decolonialising. That's the focus of the last couple of issues of our journal, and they can't afford to start a whole publishing project. But they might have expertise, particular individuals might have expertise in an area that's interesting to us, and if they put some money in the pot and they have our platform, then everybody sort of wins. So we have a number of partners that we work with on a basis of kind of contract research, which is a horrible term for basically their contribution. And every time we win a little bit of money from here or there, everyone else that gives us money sees a result on their investment, so they get to be proud that they've, so to speak, doubled the money. But it's like it's a whole game of sort of, it's a house of cards. And coming back to the readership question, I think a few years back when sort of all the advertising, the financial crisis, whatever, all the advertising income that we were getting kind of dropped down significantly. And we were looking at the costs and whether we'd have to drop staff, and it sort of felt like a tough moment, and whether actually what we were doing was worthwhile at all. And we were looking at the sort of the amount of print that was being read and picked up and purchased, and how that sales income was such a small slice of the pie in terms of costs. And then we realised that actually, because of the sort of the digital, the post-89 moment, that through JSTOR that we were getting a lot of a significant, a sort of massive amount of readership compared to our print volume. And whilst we want to maintain print, particularly of the journal, because it is this kind of curated juxtaposition of different artists that's unique to each issue, we recognise that many students and art professionals will just want to search a particular author, a particular topic, a particular artist. And if they only indulge in sort of 4 paragraphs of that text and it's useful to their research, then that's still a win as far as I'm concerned. But that was a pivotal moment for us, when actually you realise that stuff you put out there that maybe only 2,000 people bought was 5 years later accessed by 20,000 people. That, and it might be that some of the publications we do will only be read by 500 people, but perhaps if they're still around in 20 years' time, they will have a weight and importance that we can't predict yet. So, sorry, I'm conflating 2 questions into one, but I'll pass to anyone else who wants to answer that. It's a $60 million question.
No, I mean, there are no solutions to this problem besides investing basically 8% of the energy of any publishing endeavor into finding solutions. And I guess that, here what we were describing comes from doing other jobs or projects outside the publishing company, and then using that in order to produce the contents, which is not always effective. And also not hoping that sales will ever change the situation, because the way books are sold and the way books are distributed, it will really rarely allow a publisher to publish a new book out of something that has been published and sold. And it depends quite a lot on different contexts. There are contexts like Germany where there is a lot of support for publishing, and there are countries like Italy where there is no support, which, I just want to quickly go back to that, because I think, it might be also similar to other contexts, and somehow we are always talking about this sort of Anglo-centric and Eurocentric. When you say that publishing in Italian is not relevant, it's not relevant when you talk about a certain art world, no? That is international, global, etc. But there is a readership in Italy, and there are Italian artists that, for example, haven't been fully found for like many years, and that's because there's never been a public approach to financing books in Italy, neither actually to support artists. The whole infrastructure is private, and it's been always, you know, private collectors, which is also pushing quite a lot the way the market itself is organized and how things are produced. So I will say that there is no like one solution in each country. There are different possibilities, and of course the working out, I mean, thinking about it out of the box is somehow one of the solution, you know, thinking about like other platform like fundraising or in crowdfunding or like by doing other jobs. That's one more or less. But when there are contents but there are no means to produce the contents, is actually a very good sign, because sometimes there are the means to produce books, but then they are contentless in the sense they are not maybe so urgent, but there are the means because they stand for something else. And then in other cases there are very valuable contents that cannot find a form because financial side is too complicated. But at least we have a few new options with the possibility of circulating contents online. I mean, it's something, at least is, and maybe it's also partially one of the reasons why, I mean, magazines used to be the only way to exchange informations, you know. We forget about that sometimes. Artists were loving magazines because of course they were autonomous from the other art spaces and they were allowing them to experiment, but they were also the way to ship this to another collective somewhere else on the other side of the country or in another continent, and actually, you know, sharing your research. So unfortunately I have no answer to your question. I have only more questions. But at least it's a good sign when their contents are there and there are no means to produce them. Is very, very exciting for a publisher. I mean, that's what we should do, make public, right?
For instance, coming I'm originally from Portugal, and there isn't one contemporary art publication. There isn't a single one. Well, there's one called Art and Auctions, but most of us wouldn't find that relevant. What has happened in the past 10 years is that with the development of the internet, several very serious and very committed editorial platforms started emerging online, also having to negotiate this ongoing dilemma between publishing in Portuguese and publishing in another language. You know? But somehow managing to reduce their editorial costs, especially with distribution, circulation, and printing, by having online exclusive content. No, and of course we don't have time here. It's almost 9, and I'm very surprised by the amount of people who are still here joining us and ignoring their hunger. But it's another topic that it is fundamental to discuss. Is what does it mean to continue publishing, and what is the relation between printed matter and online content, and how do they talk to one another, how do they mirror one another, expand one another. But certainly I do think that in certain contexts, or at least I'm seeing this from the context of Portugal, online is certainly a way to manage to provide something that is lacking, but still dealing with the lack of an economy that supports it. No? Other questions? Well, we're going to just stay here a little bit, like packing our things, and so maybe if someone has some question or comment, just come to us. And thank you so much, Luca, for inviting us. Thank you so much for